The amorousness of some royals has been costly to their families and descendants. But there was a time in England's history when Edward Ivy's indiscretions led to the complete collapse of his dynasty. So, the 15th century, a rather troubled time. There were no kings on the English throne. And then there's Edward IV. Young, only 18, promising, as they say now, not stupid. But he had one, but fiery passion, women. And women of all ages, different appearance, and no matter what origin. The young sovereign simply loved women. Another of the king's favorite pastimes was hunting. One day Edward went to drive another animal. He spent a whole day in the saddle, very tired, and nearby was the estate of the Dukes of Norfolk. It was too late and too hard to go back, so the king decided to stay at Norfolk Castle. Naturally, the dukes were delighted. It was always an honor to host the crowned person. It should be added that the Duchess's sister was a guest at Norfolk at that time. Her name was Eleanor Butler, and at the time of the royal hunt she was a widow of 24. The Butler name meant nothing much in England in those days. However, Eleanor's maiden name was Talbot, and that's what mattered, because the Talbots were direct descendants of King Edward I of England. That is, not just aristocrats, but real kin to King Edward IV. Eleanor's father in general was a legendary figure, the winner of 47 battles. A small remark: when this military commander was once caught by the French, they did not kill him, but took an oath never to wear armor against them. In other words, not to fight. But Talbot was cunning too. He took an oath, all right. He never wore armor again. He rode out to fight without any armor. Of course, after a while, he was killed. Eleanor was the daughter of this fearless man. She married conspiratorially, as was often the case then, simply her father's friend in arms. These Butlers, of the family of the barons of Sedley, were not noted for their generosity, but it is certain that they had money, and a lot of it. Therefore, Eleanor in the castle of the Dukes of Norfolk was not a poor relative, and very even an honored guest. And contemporaries wrote that she was a stunning beauty. They met, the amorous King Edward and the gorgeous Eleanor. What happened next is unknown to anyone. Only a couple of days later, the king entered into a secret marriage with Eleanor. Why? Well, it is quite possible that Eleanor, as a far-sighted young woman, was not going to yield to the king without formalities. And he also decided to be cautious. After all, he is a king, and she, though of noble birth, but still not a princess. Secret marriages in England in those days were no surprise to anyone. It happened everywhere and often. But if there were no witnesses, there was nothing to stop them saying it never happened. But Edward and Eleanor had a witness, Bishop Stillington, a clergyman, and he had connections. Edward went away afterwards, spending very little time with his young wife. And a couple of years later, he was back in another secret marriage, Elizabeth Woodville, and that's who he then proclaimed his queen. It turned out the crowned person was a fraud and a bigamist. Eleanor had the good sense not to claim her rights. Moreover, she carefully secured favors for her family members, and her papers began to show an inventory of income from an unknown estate. The king must have given her a payoff, and just in case, for the rest of her days, Eleanor traveled anywhere only under heavy guard, because she knew that the new Queen Elizabeth hated her very much. Queen Elizabeth knew full well that her husband the king had another wife, more legitimate than her, because the first one, and no divorce had been granted. So the queen was terribly afraid that her children would not be recognized as heirs to the throne. And when King Edward died at the age of about 40, disaster struck. Bishop Stillington did not remain silent and told the king's brother, Duke Richard, about Edward's first marriage. What had been so carefully guarded became public. Of course, in full accordance with the law, Edward's union with Elizabeth Woodville was declared illegal, and all 10 children that Elizabeth bore to the king immediately turned from princes of royal blood to bastards, illegitimate, and the dynasty was jeopardized, with no direct heirs. And then Richard III ascended the throne, the same duke to whom Bishop Stillington entrusted the secret of Edward's first marriage. At the same time, 2 of the late king's sons mysteriously disappeared, and then civil war broke out. Richard III also had no heirs. His only son had died by then, and soon Richard was murdered. And the royal throne of England was taken by a very different dynasty, the Tudors. So if King Edward IV had not once paid attention to the beautiful Eleanor Butler, his descendants could have reigned in peace. The king's amorousness ruined an entire dynasty.